mate. What do you want to do tonight?
The same thing we do every night, Pinky. Try to take over the world.
Here's another audio with some pictures slapped on. I'm trying to think through the whole story about communism. It's part of examining how the future of this century is going to play out, because we're in a historical period that the Bible has explained many times, and you can prove how that historical period plays from Adam forward. And during this historical period, which will end in 2130, which began just this March, there are massive trends that I covered in my past assault video. So now I'm trying to figure out how those trends are going to play in our time. In order to do that, I have to examine communism, because it's still an ideology that's active. And here's what I've figured out. First of all, communism itself fails both as an ideology and as an economic system. If anybody could have made communism work, it would have been China. The people of China are very, very hardworking and idealistic and patriotic, and they really bought into it. Okay, it's not like Russian communism at all, because Chinese so-called communism is really very much the Chinese ethical culture going back for 2,000 years. What we call communism today was already a part of the culture in China 2,000 years ago. So it's not even really communism in China. It's just called that. It's got a veneer of Marxism, Leninism on top of it. But Marxism, Leninism as an ideology fails. It also fails as an economic system. And I'm going to try and explain why briefly here. Someday I'll have to do a web page on it. First of all, it fails as an ideology because it doesn't take into account real human nature. Marxism is based on a Rousseauian idea of man as being basically virtuous. Man is not basically virtuous. We have too much history to prove that. Man is petty, grasping, jealous, greedy. That's the old sin nature. And therefore communism can never work in practice, ever. Now, I'm going to go into more detail next on its failure as an economic system. Its economic system, of course, fails because man's nature cannot sustain it. But in history, you can trace minor successes of communism going all the way back to around 4000 BC. Basically, a family is a sort of communal unit, and the people all own everything in common, and the father is usually the head, and the sons and the daughters obey the father, and you have that kind of structure where you have a small group of families which, due to usually some kind of harsh economic condition, famine or any kind of difficulty in getting food, then a sort of communal arrangement is useful. And it's really more like military, in that you have to organize in order for everybody to get enough food. The group hunting and all that other kind of stuff. You have to own things in common because there aren't enough resources, and you're sharing all the time in order to stay alive. Okay? So throughout history, and there's a guy named Will Durant who wrote a series called The Story of Civilization. His book 1 traces out this whole idea about how at a very small economic unit of a family or a few families together, communal living was a pretty common thing. And it was especially useful during difficult economic times, which was basically agrarian in the past. And then he traced out how, as the units grew, that system didn't work anymore. All right, so basically the problem that Marx had in reading history is he read it backwards. Communism can work for a small group of people, like it worked in Athens for a very short time when they had a silver mine, so they could all sit around and talk philosophy because they didn't have to work. You have periods in history where people, a small group of people, tried it. And there are more recent examples, like in Acts 5, that was a sort of communal thing. And when the Israelis came back to make Israel work in the 1950s or so, 40s, 50s, 30s, they had communes. They called them kibbutz. And it was a short-term thing that everybody was working for a common goal. And once that goal was met, then they went back to private ownership. So communism as a small thing, due to severe economic circumstances, does have a place, but it's temporary. Okay, and it doesn't work on a large scale. That was a mistake that Marx made, and of course Lenin made. That's assuming that Lenin's real motive was altruistic, which I very seriously doubt. Lenin was too power hungry. And of course Stalin was completely power mad. So you can't have some kind of massive collectivization occur in an economy. You can't have it be forced, okay, by one group of people over another group of people. And all that rhetoric about doing things in the name of the people, I'll get to in a minute. But the economy itself can't work on a large scale, and it can't work for a sustained period of time. That's why when Stalin tried to do it with the kulaks in the 1930s, something like 30 million of people died. That's half the body count for all of World War II, and over a shorter period than World War II. And the same thing happened when Mao did it with what they called the Great Leap Forward, which was really the Great Leap into the grave. 20 million, at least 20 million people died during those 3 years that they were, doing it. Actually, they did it for more than 3 years, but 20 million people died during the 3 years from 1959 to 1962. Okay? The collectivization, forced collectivization, doesn't work. Whether you call it communism or not, it just doesn't work. Okay? There's a lot of reasons why it doesn't work. The first reason why it doesn't work is you can't force that kind of thing on people. They have to want to do it. And if they want to do it, they'll do it of their own accord. You don't have to force them.